The debris was wrong. That was the first thing Fleet Analyst Vorith noticed when she reviewed the sensor logs from Sector 19. Not an absence of debris, not too much debris, but debris that was *wrong*. The fragments from the destroyed Hegemony patrol cruiser unyielding premise were scattered across a 17,000-kilometer dispersal cone, which was consistent with a catastrophic reactor breach. The thermal signatures were consistent. The metallic composition was consistent. The tumbling velocity of each fragment followed standard ballistic decay curves with near-textbook precision. Everything was consistent. That was the problem. Real destruction was never this clean. Real explosions had outliers, fragments that caught drive exhaust at odd angles, pieces that absorbed shockwave energy differently based on internal inconsistencies in hull composition, thermal blooms that spiked unevenly because no two reactor cores burned exactly the same way. Vorith had analyzed 912 combat debris fields in 30 years of service to the Hegemony's Intelligence Directorate. Not one of them had ever been this consistent. Someone had arranged this debris. She didn't file a report immediately. She pulled the Sector 19 patrol logs instead, and that was when the second wrong thing appeared, quietly embedded in timestamp data that no one else had flagged. The unyielding premise had transmitted a standard status ping at 04:31:07 station time. Its next scheduled ping would have been at 04:46:07, exactly 15 minutes later. The explosion debris field was dated 04:38:44, 13 minutes after the last ping. In 13 minutes, a patrol cruiser with 42 crew members, full combat shielding, and a sensor array that could detect a heat bloom at 600,000 kilometers had been destroyed so completely that the only evidence was arranged debris. And no weapon in any known species arsenal could do that. The third wrong thing was smaller and somehow worse. Embedded in the debris field, tumbling in a slow, indifferent spiral, was a piece of the unyielding premise's outer hull plating. Standard identification etching intact, titanium ceramic composite confirming authentic Hegemony construction. But pressed against the inner surface of the plate, the surface that should have faced inward toward the ship's interior, was a perfect handprint, 5-fingered, roughly 20 centimeters across. Burned into the metal not by heat, but by sustained pressure, as if someone had held the plate while it was still hot enough to sear organic material, and had not let go. Vorith stared at the image for 47 seconds before she reached for her communication console. "Director," she said when the line opened, "we have a problem. The 19th sector loss, I don't think it was a malfunction." A pause on the other end. "Then what was it?" She looked at the handprint again. "I think it was a message." The interstellar hegemony had not been challenged militarily in 216 years. This was not a boast. It was simply an administrative fact, the kind that senior officials referenced with the same emotional weight they'd used to note annual budget allocations. The hegemony comprised 43 star systems, 19 member species, and a combined naval force of some 11,000 warships ranging from heavy line cruisers to the 15 planet-scale dominance engines that existed mostly as political statements. No single species or coalition had ever possessed the coordination, the resources, or the apparent willingness to directly engage that force. The humans had been assessed early. Vorith had read the original assessment herself, filed 63 years ago, when the hegemony's expansion wave had first reached the arm of the galaxy where humanity's single inhabited star system was located. The assessment was precise, methodical, and had been authored by some of the finest military analysts in the Directorate. It described a species that was biologically unremarkable, technologically developing but limited, emotionally chaotic in ways that compromised collective decision-making, and confined to a single planet with a modest satellite population and no deep space military infrastructure worth noting. The assessment had recommended a Category 7 engagement protocol, establish dominance parameters, restrict human expansion, extract resource concessions, and monitor for compliance. Category 7 was the hegemony's version of a gentle hand on a shoulder. It was used for species the Directorate considered essentially harmless but potentially inconvenient if left unmanaged. The humans had signed the concession accords 7 years later. For 56 years after that, they had been quiet. Too quiet, one of Vorith's junior analysts had asked once, reviewing the compliance records. He was young, freshly posted from the academy, still sharp enough to ask the questions that senior staff had long stopped asking. Quiet is preferred, she told him. Compliance is the objective. But she had pulled the compliance records herself that same evening, and she noticed something in them she couldn't immediately name, a quality more than a fact. The humans had fulfilled every resource concession on schedule to the kilogram. They had restricted expansion to exactly the perimeter agreed upon in the accords. They had submitted quarterly status reports that were, without exception, complete, accurate, and uninformative. They had never protested, never petitioned, never made requests for expanded terms or special allowances. In 56 years of monitoring, the hegemony had found absolutely nothing to fault in human compliance. Perfect compliance, she understood now, with a coldness that moved through her slowly, was itself a form of deception. The second ship disappeared 22 days after the asterisk, unyielding premise asterisk. This one, the asterisk calculated Dominion asterisk, a heavier vessel, a ship-of-the-line class with a crew of 112 and sensor redundancies specifically designed to prevent blind spots, vanished from contact during a routine sweep of the perimeter zone nearest human-controlled space. No debris field this time, no explosion signature, no thermal bloom, no drive exhaust trail, no distress pulse. The asterisk calculated Dominion sent a status ping at 19:14:03 and then simply ceased to exist as a data point in the hegemony's sensor network. The search teams found nothing. Nothing at all, Director Quellaram pressed, his voice carrying the particular tight quality that Vorith had learned to recognize as controlled alarm. He was old, Quellaram, with the slow, deliberate certainty of someone accustomed to events arranging themselves according to his expectations. Events were not currently doing that. Nothing measurable, Vorith said. No fragment, no energy trace, nothing residual on any band we can detect, she paused, which tells us something important. Which is, whatever took it doesn't want us to find evidence. The first loss gave us arranged debris, a controlled message. This time there's nothing at all. They're changing their approach, adapting. Quellaram was quiet for a moment. You're attributing tactical variation to an unknown party based on 2 incidents. I'm attributing tactical variation to humans, Vorith said, and watched his face carefully, based on the geometry. Both losses occurred along the perimeter nearest human-controlled space, within the scan shadow created by the Coloth dust formation. Both losses occurred during windows when our mobile relay positions would create sensor coverage gaps of approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes? Whoever planned this understood our patrol schedules, our sensor relay geometry, and our blind spot windows. Then they planned around them. She laid the probability map on the table between them. The probability that these 2 losses are coincidental natural events or mechanical failures is effectively 0. The probability that they represent coordinated action by an actor with detailed knowledge of our patrol infrastructure is pointing at whoever has been watching us comply for 56 years, Quellaram finished quietly. Neither of them said the word humans again. They didn't need to. What the hegemony's analysts debated in the following days, quietly, in sessions marked with the highest classification designations, was not whether humanity was responsible. The geometric analysis made that question essentially rhetorical. The real question, the one that kept Vorith awake through 3 consecutive sleep cycles, was the one that had no logical answer within the framework she'd spent 30 years building. Hell, humanity had no deep space military capability on record. The Accords had included comprehensive armament limitation clauses. The humans had submitted to inspection protocols every 4 years with perfect cooperation, opening their facilities, their shipyards, their research installations to hegemony inspection teams who had consistently found nothing beyond what was permitted. The most recent inspection, 11 years ago, had cataloged exactly the civilian transport fleet, the orbital maintenance stations, and the modest planetary defense arrays that the Accords allowed. Nothing more. 11 years ago. Vorath pulled up the inspection records and read them in sequence, all 14 inspection cycles, and she found the third wrong thing, not an absence, not an inconsistency, but a pattern of presence. In every inspection cycle, the human escort officers had been unusually accommodating. They had pre-prepared access documentation. They had answered questions before they were asked. They had, in one case 11 years ago, actively drawn an inspection team's attention to a research installation that turned out to contain exactly what the humans said it contained: atmospheric modeling equipment for agricultural planning. The humans had never once made inspectors wait. She understood, finally, what she was looking at. The humans had not been hiding things from the inspection teams. They had been guiding them. Every inspection cycle, they had shown the teams exactly what they wanted the teams to see, with such effortless, gracious cooperation that the teams had come away feeling they had been thorough. Meanwhile, somewhere that no inspector had ever been directed, something had been being built. For 56 years. She picked up the communication console again. "I need the complete survey maps of human space," she told the junior analyst on the other end. "All of them. Particularly any region we've relied primarily on long-range sensor sweeps rather than physical inspection teams. That will take time to compile." "I know," she said. "Get started." The survey maps arrived in segments over the next 6 hours. Vorath spread them across her workspace and began cross-referencing them against the inspection records, looking for geographic correspondence, places consistently covered by sensors but never by boots. The process was tedious, and she did it herself rather than delegating, because she'd reached the point in this particular investigation where she didn't fully trust what conclusions an unprimed analyst would reach. You needed to see the whole shape of the thing before you could understand what any single piece meant. She found it in the third segment. A region of space approximately 400 light-minutes from humanity's primary inhabited planet, in a direction away from hegemony-monitored approach vectors. The long-range sensor data for the region showed consistent, unremarkable readings: background radiation levels, standard stellar emissions from the local star, and a dense cluster of metallic asteroid bodies that created significant sensor scatter. The scatter was logged in every survey cycle as a routine navigational notation. No inspection team had ever been directed there. Because why would they be? It was an asteroid field. Except Vorath had worked in the Intelligence Directorate for 30 years, and she had spent those 30 years looking at sensor data, and there was something wrong with the scatter pattern. Asteroid fields had specific density distributions based on their formation history. This one had a distribution that was subtly, nearly undetectably, too uniform in its scatter gradient. Natural asteroid fields clumped chaotically. This one was chaotic in ways that felt carefully randomized, the way encryption noise felt carefully randomized, technically indistinguishable from true randomness, unless you knew to look for the mathematical signature of intentional randomness. Someone had sculpted this asteroid field to look like a natural sensor obstacle. She was still processing that realization when her communication console activated with an urgent flag. It was the junior analyst. She had forgotten his name, suddenly, because her entire cognitive architecture was rearranging itself around what she just found. "Fleet analyst," he said, and his voice had changed quality. "The patrol relay near Sector 24 just went dark." "A third ship." And then before she could respond, the console flagged again. "Sector 21, a fourth." "What is happening?" Quellaram's voice came through on the command channel, and for the first time in the years she had worked under him, he sounded genuinely unmoored. Vorath looked at the asteroid field data and the geometric coordinates of the 4 lost ships, and the handprint burned into the hull plate, and she said something she had never said to a director in 30 years of service. "I don't know yet, but I think they want us to notice." She was right. She was spectacularly, horrifyingly right, and it took 4 more days for her to understand exactly how right. The disappearances continued, not randomly, not chaotically, but in a precise sequence that painted a message across the hegemony sensor network in the language of absence. Each missing ship removed 1 node from the patrol coverage map. Each removed node expanded the blind zone nearest human space by a calculable increment. After 7 ships were gone, the blind zone had grown large enough that a fleet of meaningful size could transit from human-controlled space to the inner hegemony perimeter without triggering a single active sensor. They were not attacking the hegemony's ships. They were disabling the hegemony's eyes. "They're creating a corridor," Vorath said, in the emergency session that Quellaram had called with the full intelligence directorate leadership. "A navigable path from their space to ours that our sensors cannot currently see. They have been removing patrol coverage nodes in a specific geometric sequence for 11 days. "How?" Admiral Threscotton demanded. He was the directorate's senior military liaison, a species with a physiological architecture that expressed distress through subtle chromatic shifts in their outer carapace, and he was currently shading into colors Vorath had never seen him display. "Our ships have no indication of contact before loss. No weapons signature. No drive signature. Nothing. You cannot destroy a ship without producing something our sensors can detect." "Apparently," Vorath said carefully, "you can." Silence. "Our best current hypothesis," she continued, "is that the humans have developed a propulsion and hull technology that produces emissions at frequencies our standard sensor arrays were never calibrated to detect. We've been scanning for drive signatures within the bands we know. They're operating in bands we don't monitor." She brought up the asteroid field data. "We believe they have been manufacturing this capability here, in a region of space our inspection teams never physically visited because the sensor scatter from natural formation made it seem unremarkable. The scatter," she paused, "is not natural. It was engineered." "For 56 years, someone said quietly from the far end of the table. "Probably longer," Vorath said. "The original assessment that led to the concession accords was filed 63 years ago. We think they may have begun planning an asymmetric response before they ever signed." The room absorbed that. "They signed the accords," Admiral Threscotton said slowly, "already knowing they were going to violate them." "They signed the accords," Vorath corrected, "already knowing they were going to make the accords irrelevant." There was a human liaison officer stationed at Hegemony Central. His name was Davin Marsh, and he had held the position for 11 years, a middle-aged man, brown-skinned and quiet-spoken, who attended diplomatic functions with courteous disinterest and filed routine communications with the same tireless punctuality that characterized all recorded human compliance behavior. He had never caused difficulty. He had never made demands. The directorate's social analysts had assessed him as psychologically stable, professionally disengaged, and politically unambiguous. Vorath requested a private meeting with him the day after the emergency session. He arrived exactly on time, sat in the chair she indicated, folded his hands on the table between them, and waited. He had patient eyes, not the patience of someone resigned to an unpleasant situation, but the patience of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment for a very long time and had finally arrived at it. You know why I asked to meet, she said. It was not a question. You've noticed the patrol losses, he said. His voice was neutral, easy, not performing anything. 11 days of them. 7 ships, 132 crew members. Yes, he held her eyes steadily. I was instructed to extend formal condolences when contact was made. Condolences, she repeated. They were soldiers following orders in a system that placed them in harm's way. Their deaths were tactically necessary. That doesn't mean we're required to be indifferent to them as people. He paused. Though I imagine that distinction is difficult to credit right now. What do you want? She asked, directly, abandoning the procedural framing entirely. He looked at her for a moment with those patient eyes, and then he said something that reorganized everything she thought she understood about the last 2 months. We want the Accords dissolved, full sovereignty over our own systems, the right to expand along our own development trajectory without concession requirements. He tilted his head slightly. And we want you to understand that the alternative to dissolving the Accords is not a conventional war. We have no interest in a conventional war. A conventional war requires things we can't win with: numbers, industrial capacity, years of attrition that would cost us more than we're willing to spend. Then what, she said, is the alternative? He smiled briefly, and it was not an unkind smile. Something you've never encountered before, something you still don't have a name for because your military doctrines were built around opponents who behave according to models you understand. He stood smoothly, indicating the meeting was over. The ship you can't detect has been in your inner system for 9 days, Fleet Analyst Vorath. It's been within weapons range of Hegemony Central for 6. I was asked to tell you that as a demonstration of restraint, not capability. He walked to the door and stopped. We'd like an answer within 72 hours. She sat absolutely still for a long time after he left. 9 days. The ship had been there for 9 days, and every sensor array, every patrol sweep, every monitoring system the most powerful interstellar government in this region of the galaxy possessed had seen nothing. Nothing at all. And they had chosen not to fire. The 72 hours were the most analytically intensive of Vorath's career. She slept 4 hours in total across 3 days, eating at her workstation, reconstructing everything she thought she understood about human behavior and capacity through the lens of what she now knew. Her junior analyst, she had learned his name by the 2nd day, Irath, a young man with the intensity of someone who had recently discovered that his chosen field was more consequential than advertised, worked beside her through most of it. Walk me through the timeline again, she said on the 2nd day. Irath pulled up the integrated display. The concession accords are signed 63 years ago. First inspection cycle occurs 4 years later clean. 56 years of quarterly reports, 4-year inspection cycles, all clean. 7 years ago, the hegemony expands the patrol perimeter around human space as a routine strategic rebalancing. 11 days ago, the patrol losses begin. What happened 7 years ago that we didn't note as significant? He frowned. The perimeter expansion. Why did we expand the perimeter? She pressed. He searched the records. His expression changed. Because a long-range sensor sweep detected anomalous metallic density readings in the region of the asteroid cluster. The expansion was to bring that region within more reliable scan range. The silence stretched. They knew we would detect the density anomaly eventually, Vorath said, working through it aloud. The asteroid field was always meant to be a temporary concealment. When we moved the perimeter, they knew their manufacturing cover was at risk of discovery. They accelerated. She paused. The patrol losses didn't begin 11 days ago. They began 7 years ago. Everything since then has been the final phase. They've been deploying ships for 7 years, Irath said. Building them, refining them, learning our patrol patterns with enough time to map every blind spot. She stared at the display. When liaison officer Marsh said the ship had been in our inner system for 9 days, Irath, how many ships do you think are not asterisk in our inner system? He understood immediately. The color drained from his expression. The 7 patrol losses were a demonstration. The 7 patrol losses, she confirmed quietly, were what they chose to let us see. Director Quellaram called her into his office on the morning of the 3rd day. The 72-hour window had 8 hours remaining. The military council has met, he said. His voice had the flat quality of someone reporting facts they wish were different. Admiral Threskoden has proposed a rapid strike option, targeting the asteroid field region, concentrating enough firepower to destroy any manufacturing infrastructure, and then advancing to the human primary system with sufficient force to compel unconditional surrender. Vorath said nothing, waiting. I want your assessment, Quellaram said. The asteroid field is empty, she said. Whatever was built there was built years ago and has since been moved. Striking it destroys rock, and the rapid strike assumes our ships can reach the human primary system without attrition. She paused. Director, we don't know how many ships they have. We don't know where those ships are. We know one is in our inner system. We believe more exist. We have no reliable data on their weapons systems because we have never seen them fire. Every ship loss has been effectively instantaneous, leaving no time for sensor data on the attacking mechanism. She laid the probability assessment on his desk. A rapid strike would send our fleet into an engagement theater against an opponent whose capabilities, numbers, and positions are entirely unknown to us, while that opponent has had 6 days of unobstructed access to our inner system and has specifically chosen not to use it. Quellaram looked at the probability assessment. He did not pick it up. You're recommending we accept their terms, he said. I'm recommending we recognize what they demonstrated, she said. They had the capability, they had the access. They had 72 hours to give us a chance to respond peacefully. Every part of this was designed to give us a choice. She thought of the handprint burned into the hull plate. The first ship, the arranged debris, the handprint, that was them telling us they were there, not killing us, telling us. There was a crew aboard that ship, Director. 112 people on the second vessel. If they had wanted casualties, they had them. They chose otherwise. Why? Quellaram asked, and the question was genuine. Why demonstrate restraint? She had thought about this for 3 days. She had approached it from every analytical direction she knew. And the answer she'd arrived at was the most unsettling conclusion of the entire investigation. More unsettling than the undetectable ships. More unsettling than the manufactured asteroid field. More unsettling than 56 years of patient deception. Because they want a sustainable outcome, she said. Not revenge, not dominance, not the satisfaction of an overwhelming victory. They want sovereignty, and they want it in a way that doesn't require them to fight us indefinitely, which means they need us to be convinced. She looked at the director steadily. They're not operating on the logic of a species that was backed into a corner and found a desperate solution. They're operating on the logic of a species that has been thinking about this longer than we realized, with more patience than we thought any emotionally chaotic species was capable of. They didn't build an undetectable ship. They built a situation in which showing us the undetectable ship was enough. Quellaram was quiet for a long time. Irath pulled something else, she said. From the historical records pre-Accord, the original assessment team described human emotional chaos as a strategic vulnerability. Their wording was that humans made decisions under emotional stress that rational actors would not make. She paused. I think the assessment team was half right. Humans do make decisions under stress that rational actors would not make, but they misidentified which decisions those were. The irrational decision wasn't panic. It was patience. 56 years of perfect compliance, perfect restraint, perfect strategic silence, because they understood that any early action would cost them the advantage they were building. A rational species runs a cost-benefit calculation and decides the sacrifice isn't worth it. Humans decided the sacrifice was exactly the point. The concession accords were formally dissolved 14 hours before the 72-hour window closed. Vorith was not in the room when the documents were signed. She was in her office, running the final sensor sweeps that the military had demanded as a condition of the diplomatic team accepting the terms. One last attempt to locate the ship in the inner system, to verify that it was real and not a bluff, to find something in the detection data that would give the military advisors a foothold of information they could use. They found nothing. They swept every band, every frequency, every detection protocol the hegemony's technology could access, and the inner system returned data that looked exactly like an empty inner system, because that was what the human ship wanted the sensors to see. Irath was beside her when the diplomatic confirmation came through. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the blank sensor returns, and then he said something she hadn't expected from a junior analyst fresh from the academy. "Do you think there's actually a ship out there?" She looked at the sensor data. "Yes." "How many?" She turned off the display. "That's the question I'm choosing not to answer right now." He thought about that, because the answer is worse than we want to know. "Because," she said, "the answer changes nothing about what we've already decided, and it changes everything about how we sleep." She gathered the day's files with methodical care. "They built something we cannot see, and they moved it into our home system and held it there for 9 days without firing, and then they gave us a choice. What I know is the ship exists. What I don't know is how many, and where, and whether the ones we don't know about are in places that matter even more than the inner system. So we just live with that." "We live with that," she confirmed. "The same way they lived with 56 years of concession accords and quarterly compliance reports and inspection teams going through their shipyards." She stopped at the door. "They chose not to be afraid of what they couldn't control. They chose to work within the constraint until the constraint was no longer necessary." She looked back at him once. "It turns out patience isn't a human weakness. It's how they aim." 3 months after the accords were dissolved, Vorith submitted a formal analytical report to the Directorate. It was 47 pages. The summary section was 3 sentences. The hegemony's original assessment of the human species was precise in its observations and catastrophically wrong in its conclusions. The behaviors identified as vulnerabilities, emotional variability, internal conflict, apparent disorganization, high pain and sacrifice tolerance, were not evidence of strategic weakness. They were the operating conditions under which the human species builds things that cannot be found until humans choose to show them. She didn't title the report anything clever. She named it after the original assessment file it was meant to correct, and she marked it for mandatory review by every inspection team and every analyst in the Directorate going forward. She never learned the full count of ships the humans had deployed. The diplomatic agreement included no disclosure requirement for military assets, and the human negotiators had been, in their characteristically gracious way, entirely unresponsive to the Directorate's subsequent informal inquiries on the subject. She found that she respected this. There was one thing she did learn, much later, from a human historical document that was eventually shared through the new cultural exchange channels that opened in the months after the Accord dissolution. It was a private journal entry, written by the engineer who had led the propulsion team that developed the undetectable drive technology, a woman named Celestine Park, who had spent 31 years on the project and had died of natural causes 4 years before the patrol losses began. She had never seen what she built deployed. She had never seen the plan reach its conclusion. In the last journal entry, written 2 weeks before her death, she had noted something that she seemed to find more remarkable than anyone else had thought to note. "We always knew we couldn't build a fleet large enough to match them. We couldn't outproduce them. We couldn't outgun them in any direct engagement. The only thing we've ever actually been able to do that they couldn't predict was decide to be patient when everything in us was screaming to fight. That's not a strategy. That's just who we are. the part of us that refuses to accept the situation as permanent, even when we don't live long enough to see it change, especially then. The journal entry had no further commentary. Vorith read it 3 times. She thought about the handprint, burned into the inner surface of the hull plate, the mark of a hand that had held something too hot to hold and had not let go. She thought about 56 years of compliance reports filed with perfect punctuality by people who knew, when they filed them, that they would not live to see what the reports were protecting. The hegemony had looked at humanity and seen a species that accepted defeat. It had not once occurred to them that what they were actually seeing was a species in the process of winning, slowly, quietly, generation by generation, with a patience so vast and so deliberate that it looked, from the outside, exactly like surrender. The galaxy had 11,000 hegemony warships, 15 dominance engines, and 200 years of unchallenged dominion. Humanity had built something no censor could find, and had sat in the heart of the empire for 9 days, and had fired nothing, and had asked for very little. And somehow, that was the most frightening thing Vorith had ever documented. Not the ship, not the technology, not even the patience. The fact that they had been